Hello, everyone. I'm here with Kegan Chandler. Kegan is a friend that I met. We met at the Biblical Unitarian conference last August called Converge, and we had some good conversations there. And I'll link to a bunch of videos that you can find more about Kegan and some of his stuff. But Kegan has recently written a new book. Kegan has other books, but this is his newest book. It's Constantine and the Divine Mind, and it's about sort of the theology and the religious personal beliefs of Constantine himself, and how that affected sort of the trajectory of Christian theological development in the early 4th century. And I think it's a really interesting subject. I think it's a subject that a lot of people assume they already know, but when they would look at the details, it would be very different than what we expect. I'm excited to dig in a little bit more. But first, I would like it, Kegan, if you could sort of introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your story and how you've come to be a biblical Unitarian and be interested in these sorts of questions.
Sure, thanks, and very excited to be here. And the way you characterized this Constantine subject, I think, was pretty fair, and very excited to dig into some of that. A little bit about me, theologically speaking, I am a biblical Unitarian, and I'm associated with the Church of God General Conference, and I teach at Atlanta Bible College, which is run by the conference. As a historian, my research interests include Christianity, pagan religion, Japanese religion, historical Christology, and some other historical doctrines like the doctrine of original sin is a special interest of mine. Generally, in my research, I've been interested in questions about how certain traditional doctrines have developed in the Christian world, and over time, how people in different global contexts have responded or even transformed those doctrines. Focused a lot of my energy in that direction, and that's probably because those themes and those questions have been so important in my own personal experience with Christianity. In terms of family history, the serious study of Christianity and the Bible has always been in my family. My grandfather, Pat E. Harrell, was the chair of New Testament at the University of Texas and a biblical scholar in the Restoration movement. And he passed that concern for the Bible on to my parents, who for me became the greatest Bible teachers I've ever known.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain what the Restoration movement is in 1 or 2 sentences?
Sure, yeah. So that comes out of what's called the Stone Campbell movement, which is associated today with the Churches of Christ. So I'm sure people are familiar with the Church of Christ. So that's essentially was a Protestant movement which aimed to restore the beliefs and practice of the original 1st century church. And there were a lot of related groups in the 1800s in America that came out of that movement. The Church of God General Conference, which I'm associated with now, being one of them. But my parents, they instilled a passion for the scriptures in my life and a passion for getting back to the beliefs and practices of the 1st century. And I've been happy to carry that on. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I went through my own theological journey after consulting the cold, hard facts of church history, we'll put it that way. And after looking for traditional doctrines like the doctrine of the Trinity, the deity of Christ in the New Testament, up to that point, I'd actually been teaching in the Southern Baptist denomination for several years. And at that time, I was very comfortable with that. I had actually quit my university and was preparing to go to Baptist seminary. And up to that point, I had never given much thought to the idea of losing everything and becoming a heretic. But I thought, that might be fun. We'll try that out. Maybe it won't be that bad. But in all seriousness, in all seriousness, I never set out to challenge the doctrine of the Trinity. I was quite comfortable and an overly confident evangelical, I would say. But as I tried to substantiate a lot of these historical and theological matters for myself, I soon felt the constraints of history. And so historical study has always been a driving factor for me in my own theological interests. So eventually, going down that road, I came to adopt what's called the Biblical Unitarian interpretation of the New Testament's Christology, which includes what's been called a Socinian Christology. And I think those are matters that you and your audience are pretty familiar with.
Sure. What sort of first caused you to doubt Trinitarianism? Because in my experience, normally people have to have some sort of personal encounter with an alternative, really, before they even can think of something else.
Sure. So I was sort of, I was a typical evangelical apologist, and I love to debate Mormons in particular. I love Mormons. They're wonderful people. It was in a conversation with some of them where they challenged me, and I very confidently, answered all their questions, had no problems, but something stuck in the back of my head, and I decided that I wanted to historically substantiate a few of these points, just a little bit better for myself, just to reinforce for myself. And so somewhere in that process, I began to ask some very pointed questions, including one particular question, which was, who was the first Orthodox Trinitarian? And I think when you ask that one question, probably more than any other, you'll find that it takes you further and further into church history that you're probably going to be comfortable with, at least if you're a Protestant.
Yeah.
And
what's your answer to that question, by the way? That is something that I still wonder about and argue about a little bit. How would you answer it, and how would you define it?
Oh, sure. Well, by Trinitarianism here, I mean Orthodox Trinitarianism as laid out after the Council of Constantinople in 381.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we see the one God really transfer away from being the Father to the Trinity, a tri-personal God. That's where that emerges. So at earliest, the middle of the 4th century, but more acutely in the last quadrant of the 4th century.
Yeah. That's my feeling too. There's a couple quotes that bubble up starting around 360 or so that start to sound kind of 3 in 1, 1 in 3e.
That's right. By 350, those conversations are being had because the debate over the Holy Spirit is starting to really kick up.
Yeah. Although we'll be able to dig into the Council of Nicea plenty, but people should know the Council of Nicea was 325. So we could say that there were no actual Trinitarians at the Council of Nicea,
absolutely not, and
which is something that most people just don't understand. Yeah.
Right. No, actually, on that note, I keep a book on my shelf. This kind of popular level church history book, and it's from my earlier days. And and if you turn to the Council of Nicea, it says something along the lines of, and so as we can see at the Council of Nicea in 325, the Arian controversy was put to rest forever.
That's like saying that the football game ended at the coin flip. Right.
Very
But anyway, so you asked the dangerous question: who was the first Trinitarian in history?
Right.
And that leads you down a rabbit hole. How does that rabbit hole continue?
Yeah. Well, it's not just asking that question, because a lot of people have asked that question. But I think I asked that question at a certain time in my life in which I was willing to count the cost of what my life might look like if I had perhaps a different answer than I had received throughout my life. And I did a very dangerous thing in that process. And I asked God that I wanted whatever was true. And that whatever was true, that's what I would pursue, even if
be very careful if you ask God if you want to know the truth. That should only be done under safe circumstances.
Right. He'll deliver. If you appropriately counted the cost, you better be ready. So, but it's ultimately been a great experience, and I view the Bible and my faith in a completely different light and in much better light, and I'm very happy about it and wouldn't trade it for anything. But that's a little bit about my theological journey. But as a historian, I think that my personal experience with Christianity actually gives me somewhat of a unique perspective in that I don't find myself owing very much loyalty to certain traditional creeds or denominational theologies. I hope that allows me to be more objective with the data, both historical data and biblical data, and allows me to search for answers that others might be
Hmm.
inclined to avoid.
There's some
So anyway,
freedom
the
in
last several
being
years.
there's some freedom in being a heretic, right? It's mostly
Oh,
downsides, but there are some upsides, and you could use that freedom for ill, but you could
right.
also use that freedom to ask the questions no one else will.
That's right. That's right. I would say these days there's a lot of freedom in that, and less flames.
Yes, fewer
Um,
flames.
so in the last several years, as I've begun my scholarly journey, it's been very fun. It's been very personally beneficial for me in many ways. And though I'm still young and my work is still young, I've been blessed to have my research find some success, including, at least in my opinion, this book on Constantine that we're here to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, and just to kind of close up your bio section, you might not get this audience, but Kegan has a full-time job that's completely unrelated to ministry or theology, and somehow with 24 hours in the day has written multiple books, lots of articles, put out lots of content, and is just one of the Biblical Unitarian community is blessed with a lot of self-teachers who don't necessarily have all the academic credentials, but have the blood, sweat, and tears of personal angst and curiosity driven into these questions. I think you're one of the best examples of that. So yeah, so
Oh, thank
let's
you very much.
let's talk about the book. What was your goal for the book? I would say, kind of overall.
Yeah, yeah. So this book is the result of several years of research that I spent on the Emperor Constantine the Great, and also into the religious world into which he was born. And this began actually as a research project during my master's degree that I was conducting under the supervision of historian Dr. Joseph Early, who's a professor of religion at the University of Campbellsville. And in light of the significant puzzle pieces that I was starting to put together, we realized that this was a much larger project. And I was very happy ultimately to have this project picked up by Whitman Stock Publishers in the United States. And then to have the foreword written by Dr. Dale Tuggy, whose work on monotheism was especially helpful to me. So this book came about from a personal interest that I had in Constantine, in the religion of the period, and especially in the Council of Nicea, and how that kind of a setting really was the stage for the meeting of a bunch of different historical religious worldviews. I found all that very fascinating and very helpful for contextualizing certain doctrines like the Trinity and how those things have come about and why we have them today. So all that ultimately produced all of this research. And so the book is specifically about Constantine's conversion. And because of the nature of the research and my conclusions about that conversion, it's incidentally a book about monotheism. I would say it's almost just as much about monotheism as it is about Constantine. And there have been so many books about Constantine published. He's remained an incredibly popular figure, perhaps the most popular emperor to read about, and for very good reason. That I think has a lot to do with the fact that though we know so much about him, he remains so mysterious, especially in terms of his religion.
Yeah.
And this book is specifically focused on his religion and the theological reasons why he ever turned to the Christian God. Many other books on Constantine out there are much more biographical, and they speak to a range of Constantinian topics like his military campaigns and his political rivalries, or maybe they're interested in questions about Constantine's influence on Christianity and whether or not that influence was good or bad for the faith. But as far as I know, this is the first book dedicated completely to considering Constantine as a theologian and as a historian of religion, and to consider how his theological and historical views impacted his decision to ultimately turn to the Christian God, and then how those views continued to manifest in his religious policies.
Yeah, one thing that I got from your book is Constantine's no dummy. he's no block-headed jock who was just a good emperor or a good military leader who happened to find himself in charge. He was very philosophically trained, very
Yes.
theologically astute, very motivated by theological and religious concerns, and had some very interesting opinions, as we'll get into. So I think he, besides like Marcus Aurelius, maybe, he has to be one of the most philosophically sophisticated emperors that there were.
You're very right to pick up on the fact that he is absolutely philosophically and theologically educated, especially in the later parts of his career. And there's this tendency to kind of view him as, well, if people, some especially theologians will describe him as, well, he wasn't a very good theologian. He didn't really know very much. He was uneducated. He didn't know what he was talking about.
He was just a bystander. Yeah.
He's incidental. He's just incidental to the whole process at Nicaea, and didn't really have that much influence, or he wasn't interested in these topics, and that just could not be further from the truth.
Right. He seems almost just as educated as any of the bishops that were there.
And I like your wording there, that he's passionate. And that is really the heart of this book, is to reveal Constantine's passion as a religionist, his passion as a monotheist, which lasted for the whole of his career, and I argue was a passion in his life even before his alleged turn to Christianity. As you'll find in the book. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just saying, so let's start with some kind of high-level biographical facts about Constantine, and then if you could lead into, so what was his religious life growing up, and what was his education like before he was powerful or important?
Sure. So let me give you kind of a high-level look at Constantine. So Constantine was a Roman emperor. He ruled from 306 to 337. He was born probably around the year 272, though we aren't sure exactly. There is some lying going on for some very interesting political reasons. But he was born in Dacia, which is in modern-day Serbia. His father was an extremely important man. His father was named Constantius Chlorus, which, if you know anything about Latin, he was named that way for his greenish skin color. But Constantius Chlorus occupied the role of Caesar, which was one of the lesser two co-emperors of what's called the Tetrarchy, which was formed under Diocletian. He divided the empire into east and west in order to manage it better, and there were two primary emperors with two lesser emperors called Caesars beneath them. And to make a long story short, Constantine, his father was a monotheist and a worshiper of the sun god Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun. And this is a deity who had been worshipped previously by other emperors, especially most famously by Aurelian in the 270s. But Constantine grew up, I think, with these ideas in mind, and also, I think, with a sympathy for the Christians, because Constantius Chlorus, as a Caesar, actually exhibited some sympathy for the Christians. So he grew up with this kind of interesting monotheistic tolerance in mind, and I suggest this was
So could we dig into this? Because I think most people will think pagan monotheism, that's an oxymoron. What the heck are you talking about? So what in the world is pagan monotheism? What did they believe? What's the history of that? And like, if I'm Constantine and I'm an 18-year-old and I'm a pagan monotheist worshiping Sol Invictus, what does my religious life look like?
Sure. So let's talk about pagan monotheism. That's probably a good idea, because in reality, maybe I should back up and say the whole my entire examination of Constantine is wrapped up in questions about monotheism. This will probably be helpful. My main thesis in the book is that the fundamental reason why Constantine turned to Christianity was because he believed that the Christian religion could assist him in resurrecting what he believed was the original religion of mankind, which is a pure, aniconic monotheism, a monotheism with no idols. And I
So
actually,
even before he was a Christian, he thought that idolatry and idols were wrong.
not, I think around by 324, that is certainly the case. But there is a gradual change that
Gotcha.
takes place in Constantine as his theological views evolve. But there were already pagans at that time who were of the same mind. But you know, this thesis is very important and central to the book. In fact, I think this is the first book that reads all of the Constantinian evidence, his coins, his monuments, his speeches, what his biographers say, that reads all of that through the lens of a theological narrative about monotheism. What is pagan monotheism? If pagan monotheism sounds strange to you,
It does.
that's probably the effect of, I argue that that's an effect of a long and unfortunate set of historical assumptions, which have regularly pit Roman paganism and Christianity against each other on the axis of monotheism. Many people have been led to believe that to be pagan in Rome was to worship many gods in contrast to monotheism. This is not necessarily the case. Monotheism was of serious interest to many Roman pagans in this period, and actually long before that. And contrary to popular belief, Christians were not persecuted by Romans simply because they were monotheists, right? Because they were not polytheists. More precisely, I would say that they were often persecuted because of what they decided to do with monotheism, with what sort of religious praxis they thought that monotheism required or prohibited. Namely, to be a biblical monotheist, a monotheist in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is not to necessarily deny the existence of other deities or divine beings, but to deny their worship. That's one of the primary problems for Christians in the Roman world. So Constantine, I argue, was one of many Romans who were not only interested in a supreme God, but who felt that monotheism was something which could be shared by all peoples. It could be an answer to the problem of religious diversity. And many Romans believed that actually at one point in human history, monotheism had been shared by all peoples. And this is actually something that you find in the writings of Jews, of Christians, and pagans. Many great thinkers, including the Apostle Paul, and perhaps we can talk about that in a minute, had already said that a pure monotheism with no idols had once been the original religion of humanity. And to describe this history of religions, I've coined a phrase in the book, the decline of monotheism narrative. And I argue that this is a basic story. There were several versions, takes on it, but in essence, you can find this story in late antiquity, and it kind of goes like this. Once upon a time, in an earlier golden age, there existed this pure aniconic monotheism. And because of this pure connection to heaven, the supreme God was very pleased, and all sorts of benefits were enjoyed by mankind. However, all of this changed when, for one of a variety of reasons, people's hearts and minds, they grew dark. They started to turn to idolatry. They began to represent divinity in the forms of birds and beasts and men. And soon monotheism was obscured, and it was exchanged for lies or some lesser version of religion. And in some versions, especially in the Jewish and Christian versions of the story, this whole decline of monotheism process was motivated by demons. But even ancient Greek thinkers like Euhemerus, for example, had believed that once upon a time the gods of the Greek pantheon were actually human beings who later came to be imagined as gods. And so naturally, Christian apologists in the 3rd and 4th century loved to bring up the perspective of these philosophers and just bludgeon their pagan opponents with that. But this is a very prevalent story. And attendant to this story is the fact that because monotheism was lost, there's a degradation of society.
Our
Human
worship isn't as good, and our worship isn't as efficacious anymore because we have distanced ourselves from this one God because we're not worshiping him properly. So if we can reorient our worship to the one God again, then that will bring all of the blessings that proper worship brings.
Yes, the return of the golden age, right? Many ancient peoples who are interested in this idea thought that even normative human relationships deteriorated. I mean, is some of them even say, once there was no greed, there was none of these problems before we lost monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the implication is exactly as you said, that if one could reclaim this monotheism, well, then naturally God would be pleased, and man could once again return to that blessed state.
Yeah, it also strikes me that this train of thought would happen or be more likely to happen in an empire where lots of religions are mixing together, right? It's sort of like a solution to pluralism, right? Like you can imagine when all the societies are perhaps pagan all by themselves, this doesn't occur to them. But as like lots of different kinds of paganism come into interaction, and then there's these Jews and there's like Zoroastrians and like, what the heck is going on, right? Like, how do we make sense of all this religious diversity? And the Romans are sort of the first to really encounter the full scale of human religious diversity as they're building their empire, that the people, the elite who are kind of aware of the kind of the global diversity, this story starts to make sense.
Exactly right. Well, I think most people know that Romans were very good at identifying gods. When they moved into a new territory, they could simply they could either add the native god to their pantheon, or they could say, well, this god is basically the same as a god that we already worship. So isn't that great?
Yeah.
And they were very good at that. But you're exactly right. There is a philosophical movement behind all of this that I think makes all of this possible, at least at the intellectual level. Probably due to the unifying and monistic, tendencies in philosophy, right, to say that everything is an emanation of the one. And we can get into all the details, but thematically, what's important to know for Constantine is that this is a very prevalent story. It's a very prevalent interpretation of the diversity of religions, of religious history, even among Christians. And your viewers might like to see this angle that I take as well. We see this decline of monotheism narrative even in the Apostle Paul and in his letter to the Romans, go figure. So everybody knows the famous Romans chapter 1, right, where it says, although they knew God, they exchanged God, right, for idolatry. And then all kinds of unnatural things happened as a result, right?
Right, because they worship the creation instead of the creator, and
exactly right. So who's the they? Although they knew God. Well, he's writing to the Romans. These are their pagan ancestors, right? He's speaking about people not who are far away from him, far away from his audience. He's speaking in terms that they would absolutely identify with.
Right.
And so now, and of course, Paul wants us to return to the truth, right? He wants us to return to the aniconic worship of the monotheistic God. And if we do so, we'll naturally receive all of God's blessings as opposed to his curses, which have come about.
And all creation
is
is
one
groaning.
Variation on the story that.
Right, or sorry, all creation is groaning because we are not in proper right relationship with the one true God who created everything.
Yes, that's right. So this is a story all throughout that I found all throughout late antiquity, and I argue that is a basic framework that is very important to Constantine, and that it is in fact a meta-narrative that defines his entire career and how he locates his own identity and sense of purpose. So you'll see in the book, my main argument is the reason why Constantine embraced Christianity was because he believed it could help him to resurrect this ancient original religion, again, of pristine and aniconic monotheism. And he thought that this, bringing back this religious ideal to the forefront by banishing this polytheistic error, was the key to restoring this golden age, right? This would heap all sorts of benefits on onto his state and gave him long life and a great reign that he could pass on to his children.
Mm-hmm.
And I argue that he could think all of these things, and that he did think all of these things as a pagan.
Yeah.
He was a worshiper of the monotheistic sun god Sol Invictus. Most people know this. Most people like to speak about his coinage featuring this sun god. In fact, I have one of those 4th century coins
That's really
with
cool.
Sol Invictus on there, and it says to Sol Invictus, my companion, right? So whereas other emperors had, like Aurelian, for example, had worshipped this particular Roman sun god, he is very intimately related to Constantine as his companion. I go into all the reasons for that in the book. But as I mentioned, this had been the god of his father, Constantius Chlorus.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's some debate on how it was that this god emerged, which you can look at in the book. But even long before Constantine's time, this was already a Roman god for the Romans. And I suggest that this story about the decline of monotheism continued to be important to Constantine, not just before his turn to the Christian God, but even long after his reported experience at the famous Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, where he is often said to have become a Christian at that moment.
Yeah.
And
All right.
I also suggest that not. Yeah.
Let's talk about this, because there are probably 2 super famous conversions in all of Christian history. There's the conversion of Saul into the Apostle Paul, and then second behind that is probably the conversion of Constantine himself, allegedly. So what is the sort of standard version of the conversion of Constantine, and what do you think really happened or did not happen on, after, or on, during, or before or after that battle?
Yeah, so we could probably do an entire episode just on the debate over what did Constantine see? Did he see a vision? When did he convert? I mean, there's a dense family of topics here. Maybe it would be best to point out that a large theme of the book is concerned with the debate over his conversion. And this alleged episode 312 obviously plays a large part in that debate. Your listeners may or may not realize that there has existed a serious and long-running controversy over Constantine's conversion, right? Most people just say, oh yeah, Constantine, first Christian emperor, and opening most books will point you to the year 312. Everyone knows the famous story of Constantine at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, right? And the story goes that in the year 312, right before he's about to engage in this decisive battle with his brother-in-law Maxentius, Constantine at this point is going to war with the other co-emperors of the Tetrarchy, trying to bump them out to become ultimately the sole ruler of the empire, which he does ultimately in the year 324, which is right before the Council of Nicea. So there he is. He's outside the city of Rome. He's about to go into this battle against Maxentius. And as Eusebius, the Christian biographer, his Christian biographer later reports it, Constantine is there and he's praying and wondering to which god he can appeal to for help in this battle. Well, he has this dramatic vision, and there are conflicting reports between Eusebius and Lactantius, his Christian advisor. But he has some kind of dramatic vision, a vision of Jesus, perhaps involving some Christian or Christian-looking symbol in the sky. Again, there's conflicting reports. But after he accepts this vision of perhaps the cross, and he does what he's supposed to do, he wins the battle, and he becomes the master of Rome, and he rides into the city with his brother-in-law's head on a pike, and the people cheer, of course.
Very Christian.
And so the story
thing
goes,
to do.
from this point, this was when he knew that the Christian God was the one true God, right? Of course. This is the point in which he became a Christian monotheist and turned away from his pagan life, and he stopped worshiping pagan gods. And it is precisely this simplistic and misleading image that I am confronting in the book. Again, most people don't know that there is controversy over this. Controversy over precisely when Constantine's conversion took place, why it took place, whether it took place at all. Many people would say it didn't. This has been continually debated by historians since at least the middle of the 19th century, beginning perhaps with Jacob Burckhardt. He was persuasive in bringing a lot of scholars to the view that Constantine's conversion and his religious actions were actually not very religious at all, and that they were actually purely political actions. They say, the emperor actually never became a Christian. He was just play acting. And he was actually very irreligious and was even deliberately contradictory in some of his policies. This is a view which I find extremely inadequate, to put it lightly. But meanwhile, other scholars, no less partisan, have informed us that, well, no, actually the man was nothing short of a saint. He was a true Christian. He was an apostle of the church, right? In the Eastern Orthodox community, we have the Feast of Constantine, Saint Constantine. And they say this was a true Christian who banished paganism from his realm. And therefore, all of his actions were the theologically driven projects of a sincere and orthodox Christian man. And in the third camp, still others have seen Constantine as both a politician and as a sincere religionist who's working to bridge the divide between pagans and Christians in the Roman Empire.
Right. So
and
there's
that's
sort
ultimately
of
the general substrate on which I'm building.
right. So there's sort of camp number one, which is sort of the hagiographical camp, which sort of is like he had this sincere religious experience, and then he prayed, he painted crosses on his soldiers' shields, and then he won the battle, and then bam, he's a Christian. Doesn't get baptized. And some people are like, that's when he became a Christian and was sincere. And some other people are like, well, he might have faked becoming a Christian, but that was sort of a politically expedient, pragmatic ploy. And you're not saying either of those things. You're saying he didn't really become a Christian, but it's not like he was just a pragmatic, cold-hearted irreligionist. He actually had very strong and sincere religious views. They just weren't really quite Christian. They were sort of this pluralistic monotheism that was sort of in a weird in-between space between the paganism of his Roman ancestors and sort of Judeo-Christianity.
Yes, well, he's a pagan syncretist.
Yes, yes.
He's a pagan monotheist, and I think the way to resolve one approach that I take to resolving this wide-ranging diversity of views. I mean, it's kind of amazing, isn't it? Right? We're all reading the same sources, and yet we're all coming up with radically different interpretations of what this guy was about. In many ways, it's like Christology. But I think a way to fix some of this is to reconsider what it meant to become a Christian in late antiquity. And that helps us kind of understand the range of possible trajectories that Constantine might have been on. And then the other arm of this is to revisit the pagan world from which Constantine approached Christianity. All of this helps us to better recognize what he believed about his own place in religious history and his own identity. And I think ultimately that what you'll gain from that is that he sees his turn to the Christian God and his efforts on the Christian God's behalf are part of his program to restore this universal monotheism on the earth. So we have to revisit the nature of Christian conversion at that time, and we need to revisit the nature of monotheism in the pagan world. And I think that's ultimately the best path forward. You mentioned a couple of interesting characters who actually feature in my discussion about this. That's the Apostle Paul, and that is the Augustine of Hippo. And throughout Constantine's scholarship, I suggest one of the reasons why his conversion has been so difficult to map out is due to certain assumptions that we've had about what religious conversion looks like. And those assumptions have been informed by cases like Paul and Augustine, who are probably, like you said, the two other most famous religious converts ever. when we think of conversion today, it's actually pretty hard for us, I think, to keep Paul's famous visionary encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus out of our head, right? I mean, sometimes we even we talk about, dramatic change in personal ideology as having a road to Damascus moment. This is just in our Western culture, and so I suggest that the experience of Paul recorded in Acts. Actually, it has a lot of overlap with what Eusebius says about Constantine's conversion. And in many ways, Paul's conversion prepares us to accept the kinds of things that Eusebius ultimately says about how Constantine became a Christian. When you think about it, both of his experiences are initiated by these sudden and dramatic visions of Jesus. Both of them feature heavenly voices that are coming down and giving them instructions. But more importantly, both of these stories, Paul's and Constantine's and Eusebius, they both kind of condense their subject's religious conversion to more or less a single time and place. Mm-hmm. And in a very interesting way, we see Augustine's story kind of fills in the rest of our expectations about what conversion looks like. So in Augustine, we see a very emotionally charged turn to Christianity, right? His conversion,
lots of guilt and remorse, and
absolutely, it's characterized by emotional trauma, and it reflects a stern theology of sin and guilt. And so some Constantine scholars have actually looked at Constantine's life, and they say, well, because there's no emotional crisis here, because what he's doing looks more like a rational calculation, well, this is evident that he didn't really convert to Christianity, right? You see how powerful these kind of assumptions are in the conclusions that people are making. But I ultimately, what I do in the book is I consider what is called the new paradigm in the psychology of religious conversion, which is not to typically condense people's conversion experiences down to a single time and place in which they are overwhelmed with sin and feelings of guilt, but rather to look at conversion as a gradual process that takes place throughout people's lives, in which there are serial episodes of awakening, and in which people are more on a quest. The subtitle of my book is The Imperial Quest for Monotheism, because I see Constantine not only questing to revive ancient monotheism, but he is on his own quest, his own religious journey, which ultimately will bring him to a conversion. So I argue that Constantine, he was, for the whole of his career, he is a pagan syncretist. However, he is on a process of gradual conversion, which ultimately culminates in his famous baptism on his deathbed. So I'm arguing against this popular portrait that there in the year 312 he's become a Christian. Yeah, not a very good Christian, he's just figuring some stuff out, but he's a Christian there. I don't think that that's actually reflective of what's actually happened with him. And when we back up and we realize, again, two things, that we need to rethink the process of conversion, and we need to rethink his perspective as a pagan monotheist, then we see something completely different.
Yeah.
One mistake. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think one episode from your book that really highlights this. So there's the battle in 312 where it's sort of like the postcard version of his conversion happens. And then after a series of more battles, he beats his rivals and becomes sole emperor of the empire. So after he's done this, but before the Council of Nicea, he builds like some monuments to himself in Rome, right? And like, what are these monuments like? And what is the imagery that he's invoking? And how Christian or not is this imagery? So theoretically, like a decade after his conversion?
Sure. Well, this is the Constantinian monuments are one of my favorite subjects. So you'll have to cut me off if I ramble on, but This is very important because this is part of the hard evidence that helps us to see what he was all about. We shouldn't just focus on the testimonies of the Christian writers Lactantius and Eusebius, who have very clear agendas. We should also receive that testimony, but also receive the testimony, what I'll call the pagan testimony of his monuments, his coinage, and other things also. And I think both of those things will flesh out a portrait of what Constantine was all about. Because ultimately, for the whole of his career, he's a man standing between two worlds. But let's talk about this monument that you're referring to. In 312, after he has this victory, the Senate commissions a massive arch called the Arch of Constantine. And interestingly, in this arch is covered in pagan symbols. It's actually a composite piece drawn from other, much of it drawn from other pre-existing monuments. But there are reliefs of the sun god and other gods. There was a statue of Constantine in a quadriga, in a chariot, which is now missing. But interestingly, there are no Christian symbols on this monument whatsoever. Now, and according to the Eusebian and Lactantian versions, right, Constantine in 312 at this battle at Milvian Bridge painted this Christian symbol either on his shields or marched forth with it as in front of his army. That imagery is completely absent from the battle scenes depicted on this arch, which is very interesting. But in addition to that, a scholar named Elizabeth Marlowe discovered this. There was once a massive statue of Sol standing in Colosseum Valley there. And this massive statue, when you view the arch, when you're standing in front of the Arch of Constantine and you're looking past it to the statue, it gives you different, what I would say, theological imagery. Standing at different distances will show you at one point there's an overlap between the sun god, who again is a supreme god, and Constantine. So there's a blurring of the lines between Constantine and the sun god from this particular distance, which is reflective in Constantine's coinage. There is a particular brilliant gold medallion that is minted by Constantine several years after the Milvian Bridge, which again is when he's supposed to have become a Christian and quit paganism. And in this, Sol Invictus and Constantine are standing like almost overlapping. They're blurring the lines between this deity and the emperor, and that's what you see reflected in the monument as well. When you step further back, there's actually remains of an aqueduct behind here. Maybe I can send you some pictures of it. I was just there last year, took some great pictures. But there's an aqueduct further back from the monument, and when you back up at that distance, well, now it looks like the supreme god is now standing over Constantine, watching over him and sort of guiding him, right? This plays directly into my theme that I've highlighted, and many other historians have recognized this, that Constantine sees himself as the agent of the supreme god. He's the supreme god's chosen man who is commissioned to restore this universal religion. And even in his Christian writings, he describes this story, right? He says that, Jesus did a pretty good job until he got killed by the Jews, and it was definitely the Jews, by the way. But he, Jesus had tried to restore this universal monotheism, but now in Constantine's life, he's God's agent who is going to empower him and do this. So there is this close personal relationship that Constantine is always said to have with this deity. And this is reflected also in the inscription that is on the main frieze of the monument, in which a relationship between Constantine and something called the divine mind is described. Now, there's some debate there. Is this Constantine's divine mind being talked about, or is this a divine mind that is partnered with Constantine? Well, I think that overlap is actually deliberate, which is exactly what we see in his coinage and in the statuary.
It's almost like he's saying that he's the incarnation of the one true God.
Well, it's interesting that,
do you think that Constantine thought of himself as divine in any sort of way?
You mean in terms of like an ontological, like he's deity, like an incarnate deity or something?
Or something, or
no, so not at all.
No.
So when you back up, I think you can understand more of what Constantine is up to with all this religious imagery when you consider the imagery of his predecessor Diocletian and Maximian, his co-emperor. So just a little background. Diocletian was interested in the revival of Rome's great traditions in the promotion of many deities. And he very famously launched a great persecution, which many people are aware of, in which he's trying to stamp out these Christian monotheists and to promote the worship of Rome's most ancient tradition. So he's all about there being many gods. And interestingly, I think the reason for this is because the rule of a particular emperor must always be connected to heaven, right? Because a lot of these emperors don't come from famous families like the Julii or anything. So they have to substantiate why they should be the ones to rule over everything.
Right, and they're not democratically or republicanly elected anymore. So they need to legitimate themselves, and they use religion.
They need to justify their rule. Right, so Diocletian's big idea was the tetrarchy, in which he divides the Roman emperor into a pluralistic pluralistic rule, and so he's got to justify that, right? So there can't be one supreme God. There's got to be a lot. There's got to be a lot of gods ruling the heavens,
and we can map different rulers to different gods.
And what we see is even in Sure. So Diocletian thinks of himself as the right arm of Jupiter. Now, there's one panegyric in which people get confused because this panegyrist says that he is Jupiter, an ever-present Jupiter near at hand. But that's actually a panegyrist getting a little too excited. In all of the rest of the evidence, Diocletian is portrayed as Jupiter. He is wearing his clothing, Jupiter's clothing, and holding his traditional ornaments in the coinage, but he is absolutely the agent or a son of this god. He is not really this one god himself. And his co-emperor Maximian is cast as Hercules. That's his patron deity, and he's also depicted wearing, the lion skin of Hercules and everything. So these guys portray themselves in their official propaganda as the agents of the traditional pantheon who are hell-bent on restoring the honor of that pantheon, the worship of that pantheon in the Roman Empire, by which they think the empire is going to get all kinds of great benefits from these guys. Now, compare that to Constantine. I describe Constantine in the book as, in a sense, the anti-Diocletian. He is the agent of the supreme God, who has commissioned him to come and upend all of this polytheistic error. And so that's the context, I think, in which we should view Constantine's depiction of himself as the supreme God. He says so in the famous coinage right there. This God is his companion. He is not this one God. And I think when we read all of this through the decline of monotheism narrative, it makes even more sense, where he sees that Jesus had been sent by God to bring back monotheism, to enlighten mankind, but what his mission was cut short. That is exactly what Constantine is doing. He's finishing the monotheistic revival that Jesus started. Ambitious.
pretty ambitious. So he would maybe view his predecessors' failures as effects of their polytheism, and that he could reverse the errors and the decline of Rome by uniting the whole empire under one emperor himself, who has this special connection,
Oh, absolutely.
whether it's agentival or he's the son of the soul Invictus, or he's like his chosen renewal king or something like that. A very almost like an incarnational, not quite
He's his chosen
incarnational.
agent.
Yeah, yeah. And so that is how
Yeah,
he's
I wouldn't say, you know, literally.
right. Not
Yes,
literally
that's
the
right. And
God
I like your
himself.
point about the failures. Right,
Go
and I
ahead.
like your point about the failures of the Tetrarchy.
Hmm.
Constantine is a student of religion. He's a historian of religion, and we see that in his later letters, he very much has looked into pagan traditions, which have viewed the all of society's degradation as a result of the loss of monotheism. He even points to the Egyptians and shows how once they were this great empire, however, bad religion showed up, and which ultimately resulted in human sacrifice and all these terrible things. And he describes how he saw this. He saw the effects of this when he was in Diocletian's court as a young man traveling around the empire. He says, I went there, I even saw the most unfortunate of these cities, Memphis, which has been laid to complete waste. So he's seen these effects in real life. He's seen the chaos and the bloodshed of the great persecution. And all of this is informative for him that monotheism is the way to go, and he should be the anti-Diocletian. So yeah, that's absolutely very important. Now, one other thing to point out is that let me put it this way. I think where a lot of studies go wrong about what Constantine was up to is they often get wrong what Constantine was doing with his former beliefs, his pagan beliefs after the year 312. Okay, on the one hand, people have said, well, he started off worshiping the sun god, and he never stopped worshiping the sun god, and he never really became a Christian, and his speeches about the Christian god, it's all just for show. On the other hand, some have said that, well, he started worshiping the sun god, and then he stopped worshiping the sun god at the year 312, and he started worshiping the Christian god. But of course, there's a hidden third option here. There usually is, right?
They're the
And I
same.
say Constantine, he didn't stop worshiping the sun god and start worshiping the Christian god. Rather, he believed the sun god and the Christian god are one and the same. And we can, you'll notice the title of my book is Constantine and the Divine Mind. And I explore in the book this divine mind language. And I show that this was language that's common not simply to Christian theologians, it was more sparingly used there, but is a prominent theme in the pagan world and among Stoic philosophers, among pagan Hermeticists in the Hermetic Gnostic tradition, which is a monotheistic tradition, and in the tradition of Sol Invictus. There's the famous, these references to the divine mind. A lot of scholars will say, in his the references in the Arch of 312, they'll say, well, see, these pagans, they were kind of embarrassed about Constantine's conversion to Christianity. So they didn't want to name, the Christian God in this monument. So they just called him the divine mind. It's something vague and innocuous, and everybody could kind of get on board with that. Pagans could kind of be misled to think he's still one of them. And this is just totally misguided and misses quite a bit, I think. The language referring to the divine mind, which is not just in the Arch of 312, but is also in the panegyrics of 311, long before the episode of the bridge, and in the panegyrics of 313. This is, in fact, pagan language, and it is representative of a long tradition of pagan monotheism.
Yeah,
and we should read that and understand that, but at the same time take into consideration the Christian evidence that he is absolutely firm in his genuine belief in the Christian God.
Yeah, so I think this would be a good time to ask you about syncretism and pluralism. In the book, you kind of line out different forms of syncretism and pluralism, and exactly like the way that I think about it is like there are modern people who will be like, all world religions point to the same thing, right? Like, Hindus are feeling the leg and they're like, oh, it's a leg, and Sikhs are feeling the tail and like, oh, it's like a tail, and et cetera, et cetera. But really, it's all the same elephant, right? And it seems like what you're saying, and I would love for you to go into this and correct me if I say anything that's not quite right, is that Constantine is saying that, look, all monotheisms are basically the same, and that they're all these remnants of the original true faith, right back from that golden age, like that you talked about, and that all monotheisms are trying to get back to that, and they're really all on the same side and all on the same team. So whether you're a Hermeticist Gnostic who worships the divine mind, or you're a pagan mystery, Neoplatonist who worships Sol Invictus, or you're Jewish, although seemingly he doesn't like the Jews for some reason, or you're a Christian, you're all on the same team, guys, right? It is sort of basically his point.
Yeah, so yes, and I would say that this idea that all religions are the same. Well, this is not an idea confined to Indian religions. This is a very popular idea in late antiquity, and monotheism plays a huge role in that unification and resolving the challenge of religious diversity. What I've cataloged in the book are 3 different ways in which a pagan could see, in which a monotheist, for example, could still affirm that other people's gods existed. So you could be, in the biblical traditions, right, in the Judeo-Christian traditions, you could believe that these other deities of the world's religions are simply, they are subordinate deities beneath the one supreme God of the Bible. Maybe they correspond to the angels or to the demons of the biblical traditions. So they could still exist, right? And of course, you would recommend that people should not worship them and they should worship the supreme God. You might be a monotheist who thinks that all the different gods of the world's religions are simply different names for the same unitary entity, right? You call him this, I call him that, but we're really all talking about the same one guy. And I've also found a third form of monotheism in late antiquity, which is really a variant on this pluriform monotheism that I just described, which says that all of the world's deities, or at least some of the world's deities, are various emanations, substantial emanations radiating out from one supreme God. And you'll find this, for example, in the Hermetic tractates, right, like the Asclepius, which describes these many gods, which are real and are apparently many, but there is an underlying principle that is uniting them all as one. There's this grand scale of divinity that is ultimately substantially related back to the one. So these are just many. So you can easily see how philosophers interested in pluralism were able to justify religious pluralism on the basis of monotheism. Now, did the average Roman think about all these distinctions? Maybe not. They maybe just believed, well, it's all one, it's all the same thing. They might not have given so much thought to these distinctions, but there were certainly some philosophers, especially Neoplatonists, who would justify pluralism along these lines. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, what I would say, when we approach what Constantine was up to, he wasn't as interested in saying all religions are the same, or all religions are equally valuable, or everybody's just doing the same thing. He actually is extremely opinionated, especially as he gets along after the year 24. He becomes extremely opinionated, especially on the topics of idolatry and blood sacrifice. He thinks these things are abominations, right? Now, unfortunately, a lot of scholars have been led to say, oh, well, this is evidence that he's an anti-pagan Christian. Not necessarily so, because there were some pagan monotheists, again, who disdained the same things. One thing that I found helpful is taking a philosophy of religion approach to this whole situation. And if you look, there's one philosopher who named Michael Stenmark, who he describes a particular view of what we might call core pluralism, which I think best describes what Constantine was ultimately up to, at least in the second half of his career. Stenmark describes this as a some are equally right view. So not all religions are equally right, but some of the world's religions are equally right on certain core and basic beliefs. But on other beliefs outside of that core, maybe one or the other is right, or maybe both of them are wrong. So, for example, I think what Constantine has done is he's actually surveyed the Roman religions, and he has identified certain monotheistic traditions. It's the monotheistic traditions which have gotten it right, and gotten it right on, say, the basic principle of monotheism. But maybe certain other pagan monotheistic traditions here or there who were into blood sacrifice, maybe they were wrong and the Christians were right about that particular point. I think that's very helpful for understanding how Constantine could be very interested in this universalizing, unified Roman religion that he thinks everybody should be able to get on board with, but at the same time can have very, very strong feelings about certain religious practices that he thinks are wrong. We should approach him, I think, in that way.
Right, and his goal isn't simply wiping paganism under the rug per se and wholesale replacing it with Christianity. He sees monotheism as a bridge, as like you actually don't disagree as much as you think, guys. If you pagans just treat your gods as emanations of this one true God, and well, then we think about what the Christians are saying, well, you guys aren't that far apart, right? It isn't so much a swapping of one for the other as it is a syncretic bridge of peace to unify things, and not just to unify things, but to then bring the divine blessings of, healthy empire and economy and peace and prosperity and all that.
You're right. He really believes in this. He is very sincere, as I find him. You're right. He's not interested in wiping out paganism by force. He is interested in wiping out traditional religion by force of reason. Mm-hmm. We probably can't really talk about his religious policies, though, without talking about somebody who's extremely, extremely important, which is Lucius Lactantius, mm-hmm. who is his religious advisor. Lucius Lactantius has occupied central space in several studies in the last 10 years, and I think it's opened the door for a revolution in Constantinian studies. But essentially, Lactantius was a Christian preacher who, believe it or not, was actually brought into the imperial court by Constantine's predecessor, Diocletian, who was the great persecutor of Christians. But
how does that work? How is that possible? So Diocletian is running around killing all of these bishops and theologians and monks and stuff, but yet he has Christian philosophers in his court of philosophers?
Well, of course, there continue to be questions about Diocletian's views. Mm-hmm. Famously, according to tradition, it's actually his co-emperor Galerius who initiates and urges Diocletian towards the great persecution after certain oracles of Apollo seemed to fail. They blamed it on the Christians, and oddly enough, Galerius, who launches into this anti-Christian campaign, he ultimately comes down with what seems to have been a painful form of cancer, and he ends up at the end of his life begging for the Christians to pray to their forbidden God to heal him, and promises to lift the persecutions in the event that they do so. So a lot of mixed emotions going around with these guys, but
it's just a fascinating time period.
Imperial court.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just saying, it's just
Oh, certainly.
fascinating. This is just way more complex than people let it be. Yeah.
Sure, we need to get away from these simplistic notions of Christians versus pagan polytheists.
Mm-hmm.
But imperial courts at that time were not simply collections of aristocrats or bureaucrats. They're actually collections of diverse collections of intellectuals from around the empire. So you might have a Platonist, you might have a Stoic philosopher, you may have a Christian on board, you might have a variety of rhetoricians. This is just the way that this worked. And interestingly, Lactantius is composing at the tail end of his of Diocletian's reign. He's composing a very famous book called the Divine Institutes. And this book is actually I love reading this book. It's incredible. It's this massive riposte to anti-Christian arguments made by philosophers like Porphyry. And in this book, Lactantius is arguing for the closeness of the pagan world and Christianity. Right? The Romans, their argument against the Christians is that Christianity is something new, that it is something which goes against the traditions of the elders. This is very dangerous, right? And even if you don't believe in the traditional gods, like some of these philosophers, going against these traditions is just going to be bad news for the Roman state. This is what we've always done. This is how our society is held together with sacrifice and all of that, right? So even someone like Cicero should say you should keep sacrificing to the gods, not a problem. So what the Christians doing is new and it's dangerous. So Lactantius and many other apologists, their tactic is to say, well, actually, we Christians are not saying anything different than what our pagan ancestors have always said. In fact, all the world used to be monotheists.
Yeah.
So it would be up to men like Lactantius to search through pagan religious history to find these traditions, right? So he lumps everybody in there, Plato, and everybody's all worshiping one supreme God. Some of these, he makes some of these identifications a little bit more accurately, with some guys more than others. But in Hermeticism, he actually finds the strongest link, and he quotes from the Hermetic tractates at least 14 times, maybe more. That's what I've been able to find. But the Hermetic tradition of pagan monotheism is very important for Lactantius in showing that what he is and the Christians are saying is nothing new. And I like your language about forming a bridge. That's exactly what he's trying to do. And really, it's a passionate book, because this is really a matter of survival for these guys. But interestingly, Constantine, he was a member of Diocletian's court also for certain political reasons. And I think that's actually where he came into contact with Lactantius. And I think he must have come into contact with Lactantius and with his teachings before he came into power. Because when he does come into power, he appoints Lactantius to be the tutor for his sons.
Interesting. So
he obviously...
So Lactantius, instead of a Christian apologetic style of, here's all the reasons why Christianity and paganism are different, and here's all the reasons why Christianity is better, he's emphasizing the similarity, the compatibility with certain traditions in the Greco-Roman world, whether it's Platonist philosophy or Hermeticism or this, that, or the other thing. And he's emphasizing the similarity and like, hey guys, we're really on the same team. And this is a Christian philosopher in the court of the emperors.
Yes, I think that's generally fair. Of course, he's going to be quick to point out the ultimate supremacy of the Christian understanding. Right, he's pointing at these guys, these various traditions, as pious pagans who were longing for the truth. They had caught some glimpse of it, but in the Christian tradition, this is where real monotheism, is really restored, and we can get rid of all these other, accoutrements. And that's one of the reasons I think Constantine is ultimately attracted to Christianity, because he agrees that Christianity is a more pure form of the monotheistic ideal that he's interested in. That's kind of a separate thing. But I'll say Lactantius is extremely important, back to our question about religious diversity, because what Lactantius argues is that the way you get the empire back on board with true religion, with monotheism, is not by force, right? Because what he's witnessed the barbaric cruelty of the tetrarchy as it tries to stomp out his religion, right? So he composes, and it's interesting actually what he does, because remember, as we discussed earlier, Diocletian portrays himself as Jupiter, as Jupiter's right-hand man, right? So Lactantius goes into the history of, well, let me tell you where Jupiter really came from. He was this crazy guy, and people eventually made him to a god, and all this kind of stuff. So he exposes the foundation of the tetrarchy is completely unfounded, is completely inappropriate and based on lies and confusion. And he says, but the way that we're going to get people to understand true religion is not by force, but rather by using reason, by using argumentation. He says, we Christians, we don't force people by the sword. We argue, we reason with people, because in his view, and in the view of other pagan monotheists, monotheism is considered to be the most rational religion. It was obvious to these guys that there's only one God. And of course, you can see why they would say that, using Greek philosophy to say that there's only one ultimate thing. And so the way that you do that, and also there's a moral component here, because for Lactantius and the Christians, obviously what Diocletian is doing is wrong. It's wrong to force somebody to worship in a certain way. And so he believes then that the reconciliation of everyone's religion back to the true God would come about not by force, but by way of reason. And this is, I argue, extremely important for understanding what Constantine's religious policies were after he turned to the Christian God around the year 312. There are scholars out there many of them, who will paint Constantine as an anti-pagan after the year 312. And not only that, but he is someone who outlawed paganism in his realm. And many Christian historians will take this aim because I think a lot of them are wanting to portray what Constantine ultimately did, his involvement with Christianity, as a positive thing, right? Because it's obviously built a lot. Mm-hmm. And so he was absolutely not a pagan. In fact, he outlawed paganism. But this is not an opinion, confined to Christian scholars only. There are some few classicists that are interested in this idea, notably Timothy Barnes. Most Constantine scholars will tell you that Constantine ultimately made no major changes to the legality of traditional Roman religious practices in the empire. But Barnes has argued, for a long time that no, Constantine banned paganism. He outlawed sacrifice, right? If you outlaw sacrifice in the Roman Empire, you have outlawed traditional religion completely. Anyway, I don't see that at all. What I see is that Constantine has a policy of concord, mm-hmm. And of religious tolerance, right? So, a policy of religious tolerance. If you just have a policy of religious tolerance, you are allowing a plurality of religions to exist, and without any kind of real program to ultimately bring them to one or the other. In a policy of religious intolerance, you don't allow religions to exist, and you have a program to force people into one religion or the other. What I see, though, is, and I'm not the only person to see this, by the way, Elizabeth de Gesser has a great book on this. But essentially, there is a policy of concord in which various religions are allowed to exist. However, there is a program and a hope to ultimately get them all on board with one, but you're not forcing them. That would be intolerance. So again, I see all of this is lining up perfectly with what Lactantius thinks this monotheistic empire should look like, and how people should not be forced into monotheism, but should be led to it by way of reason. And
Hmm.
you see this exactly in Constantine's own speeches, where he says, taking up the persona of the agent of the supreme God, right? He says, I will show them, I will show the people what religion and what kind of worship the supreme God requires, right? He's this great example to show people, to shepherd the Roman Empire back to the true religion, not to force them like the Tetrarchy did at the point of the sword. And you can read the book, and look, there's a big debate, and I do go into all the, maybe some of your more informed listeners are, well, what about this and what about that? Read the book. There are some great explanations that can be made for what Eusebius has to say about Constantine banning certain pagan religious practices and all that. It's much too much to go into here, but I would draw attention to our attention to the letter to the Eastern Provincials, in which he explicitly says that he wants to allow the religions that he doesn't agree with to exist. He says, let them have their temples of falsehood, right? But eventually he wants them to all come around. He says, if they, maybe this tolerance will ultimately show them that this is the best way to go. So the topic of Constantine's religious policies is definitely one of the more contentious areas of Constantinian scholarship, and I suggest your listeners that check that out if they're interested in it.
Uh-huh. And your general point is that he had a softer hand than some Christian apologists might want to say, because he viewed the power of reason and persuasion to be more important and ultimately more just, probably. I think it sounds like it was his own internal conviction
Oh,
that
absolutely.
religion wasn't something to force on people, but he also knew he was right, right? Like, he's like, if you give everyone the space to think and some time to reflect and some exposure to the right ideas, they'll come over to my side.
Yes, and
So,
he thought that Christianity, in my argument, would help him to expedite that process for the Roman Empire. That
yeah.
they had the organization and the means by which to do that, and that their interpretation was the purest form of his monotheistic ideal. And I argue that it's possible that he came to believe this at least as early as the year 310, around the time when Lactantius joins his court. And when Lactantius finishes his book, The Divine Institutes, and actually rededicates it to Constantine.
Mm. So I think now we should transition to, my channel often talk and focuses on the Trinity. So I think we should focus on the Council of Nicea. Obviously, this is something that we could talk for hours and hours and hours about, but this is sort of the climax of Constantine's interaction and influence with the development of Christian theology.
Right.
So I guess I'll start out by saying, if you get the normal Christian's shtick on the Council of Nicea, it goes something like this. The Emperor Constantine was an evil pagan until he saw a vision and changed his ways, and then he won control of the empire, and then he wanted to unite all the Christians, and obviously Christians had always been Trinitarian, but suddenly there was this evil guy Arius who is not a Trinitarian, and he had convinced a whole bunch of people. So they convened the Council of Nicea, and they decided that Arianism was wrong in favor of Trinitarianism, and we've never argued about it again. And that declared Trinitarianism the final theology of all of Christianity for all time, and all Christians can point back to the Council of Nicea as deciding the final true faith of Trinitarianism, and QED, Constantine, we're all done. And so I think that I would like you to unpack, so that's quite a job, I know, but if you could unpack some of the context and how that normal narrative that gets told is wrong.
Oh wow, yeah, that's a lot. Well, basically, what you said isn't true. The end. There are so many angles to the dramatic history around the Council of Nicea. There have been so many books that have been written about it, and ultimately, what we do have, to put it in a nutshell, is we have a local debate in northern Africa around the relationship between God and Jesus, the metaphysical relationship between the Father and the Son. And Constantine ultimately hears about this and is upset. Now, why is he upset? Well, this, I argue, can also and should also be read through this program to unite the world beneath monotheism. We should also read it in light of his reaction to the earlier controversy between 314 and 316 regarding the Donatists in northern Africa, in which there were factions arguing over who was the true church. That's a vast oversimplification, of course, but he's very, very upset by this. And actually, I think the years between the years 314 and about 317, 318 were very impactful on Constantine. He had attached himself to this Christian world, thinking that it was going to help him bring the entire Roman Empire to what he calls a simplicity of concord and to a single opinion about these things. And my goodness, how can we do that if the Christians are fighting with each other? That's not going to work. And now when the Arian controversy rears its ugly head, we've got Christians arguing about monotheism itself. Well, that's a huge problem. You guys are supposed to be a beacon on a hill for the entire empire, not quibbling over these things. So Constantine ultimately writes letters to the theologians who are arguing, to Arius and to his bishop Alexander, and he implores them, please keep your dispute from the public eye. We don't need to worry about the particulars here. Like you said earlier, Sam, we're all on the same team. He even implores them to look to the traditions of the pagan philosophers and to see how they don't quibble about these trifles. And so his desire is for unity. That is absolutely certain. His desire is for unity and peace and for a simplicity of concord and opinion. But it's not unity for unity's sake. Again, many people following in Jacob Burckhardt's tradition might say, well, he just wanted peace because, I don't know, it's easier to manage.
But yeah, for him, peace came from God. It was a gift from God, and you need to get on the right side of God to get the peace. He wasn't trying to fool people with God to trick them into peace. He thought that peace actually came from proper worship of God.
We should always be careful in this era in which benefits for the state were achieved by good religion. We should always be careful of too sharply extricating those things.
Yeah.
For people like Constantine, doing religion right was how you had good government. That was the way you did good government. That was the way you had peace and stability for the realm. That is evident in his letters. In fact, he even writes a letter in which he exempts Christian bishops from certain mandatory public services because he doesn't want to interrupt their monotheistic worship that's beaming up to heaven. Because he says if you break that connection of their worship to heaven, then all kinds of ills will befall the state. So he's very concerned about Christian peace and unity, but it's theologically driven, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So he wants to resolve this issue at Nicaea, this argument. We won't rehash the whole argument, but there's a very important element of the Council of Nicea, and I think this is the best way to approach and kind of reveal some of the underlying issues, and that's by considering the word homoousios, the Greek philosophical term, which was ultimately used at the Council of Nicea in its final definition to define the relationship between God and Jesus. This term is often translated as of one substance or consubstantial. Mm-hmm. And my research in the book on this point is relied upon the work of Christopher Stead and P.F. Beatrice and others regarding the origins of the word homoousios. It's very important. Scholars have long seen that this word this very important and now very orthodox word, first emerges in the Gnostic world. The earliest instance of this word comes from the Hermetic treatise Poimandres, a very important text.
We've mentioned Hermeticism a couple times. Do you want to give just like maybe like 2 or 3 quick sentences on what Hermeticism is? We probably should have done that earlier.
Sure. So Hermeticism is a pagan tradition. It's a non-Christian tradition that is often identified by scholars with Gnosticism, or an early form of Gnosticism. That's in a very contentious category in and of itself that we could talk about. And this was a religious philosophical tradition. It is a combination of Platonism and Egyptian religion. Essentially, when Alexander the Great moved in and Hellenized Egypt, there was a syncretism that occurred there between the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. And out of that tradition, Greek people interested in astrology and in philosophy develop a tradition, a religious tradition, which marries all these elements together. And in this tradition, you have a central revelator, Hermes, who delivers gnosis, which is knowledge of the self, and knowledge of the one, which are intimately and substantially related. And so in that sense, it has been described as Gnostic. We could go into all what all that means.
That's probably good for now.
Yeah, that's the basic gist. So it's out of that sort of world that we see the first instance of this very important word, homoousios. So as I mentioned, the earliest example is in the tractate Poimandres. So I'll just describe this because it's very important for, I think, for understanding Nicaea, and I'm not the only person who thinks this. When you read Poimandres, you encounter a doctrine that is very similar, eerily similar, in fact, to the Nicene Creed. In Poimandres, we read that there is a God, the first God, called God the Father, in fact. And he has a Logos, his son, and these are distinguished as two entities, and both possess the same divine perfection, or divine nature. And the Logos had proceeded from the Father, and it says that they are homoousios.
Where have I heard that before?
Yeah, and this word works specifically to describe their relationship as one of kindred substance. So the question then becomes, well, how do we know that this is informative for Nicaea? How do we know that Constantine was aware of this text? Because as is well known, or I hope it's well known, Constantine is the one who ultimately inserted this word into the Nicene Creed. There have been a variety of explanations that people have given for how this word has gotten into the Creed, and this is absolutely the best one. And
could you mention the fact of how that word had previously been condemned in the Christian tradition?
Sure, no, absolutely. So at the previous Council of Antioch in 263, this word was actually condemned by the Christians there as a definition of relationship between the Father and the Son.
And why was it condemned?
268. So, well, you have to understand kind of a little bit before that. It was absolutely something understood to be Gnostic, and something understood to be pagan. And what had happened was Paul of Samosata, who is actually
one of our forerunners,
a Unitarian.
Mm-hmm.
He gets in trouble because he starts, it's all very vague to us now, of course, but he was using this word in some sense, getting a little creative. And in 268 at Antioch, a lot of leaders got together. They banned not only Paul's theology, but specifically that word and the use of that word. This is a fact that would cause serious embarrassment, as you can imagine, for the theologians who are arguing to now include this word as the official definition of relationship between God and Jesus.
were there any church fathers or theologians or bishops who were at both councils, like 268 and 325? So that's like, almost 60 years apart.
Yeah. No,
So
they're from different eras, which allows people to creatively interpret what they were up to.
yeah.
But what the point is that there is a heretical shadow looming over this word by the time of the Council of Nicea, and not simply because of people like Paul of Samosata. For example, in the 4th century, this was a well-known property of the Manichaeans, another Gnosticizing group, very unsavory characters in the eyes of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And we can, and one of the things I do in the book is I actually look at the letters between Arius and Alexander about this word. And from those letters, we can deduce that even the principal figures of the Arian controversy have a negative view of this word. We get that sense from Arius's letter, because when Arius is defending himself to his bishop, he says, hey, look, it's not like me and my friends are using, it's not like we're saying the Father and Son are homoousios or anything.
Yeah.
Which implies that this is something that both he and his opponents mutually condemn.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about this word is that by the time of Nicaea, the word could be interpreted in a variety of ways. That's why it's useful. But
it's always been that way.
Yeah, but the original understanding is important. The original general understanding of this word in pagan and Gnostic circles, it means something like made of the same element or made of the same kind of stuff. This is a word often used alongside notions of emanation, right? So you would have two distinct beings who severally have the same divine substance, right? As opposed to jointly constituting the same single instance of a divine substance. And the other thing about this word is that it almost always had a materialistic connotation. It's very, very important because in the East, in the Greek East, people have a strong aversion to that sort of theology, materialistic. That's one of the reasons why homoousios is rejected, because it seems to suggest that God is some material stuff and that the Son is just a piece of God's stuff.
Yeah.
And so, and ultimately, that's one of the, I argue in the book that that's one of the great achievements of Nicaea. One of Constantine's great achievements is actually shifting the normative meaning of homoousios away from a materialistic sense into some other kind of mysterious sense.
So let's setting the stage, because I think this moment is just like absolutely critically important. And like you said, I think it's one of the most important things that happens in Constantine's life. And it's been causing you and me problems ever since. So the controversy that's leading up to this, people you'll learn in your subpar seminary class that there were the Trinitarians and the Arians. Well, no one called themselves Trinitarians at that point in time. There was Arius and some people who agreed with him, and then there was sort of the anti-Arians. They didn't really have a name for themselves. And the argument wasn't whether or not God was three things in one thing versus one thing. There was no one who thought that God was three things in one thing at that time, or at least they weren't mainstream, or at least we don't have their writings. And the argument was whether or not basically the Son was on equal standing in terms of his divinity as God, or whether the Son was perhaps a secondary quality of divinity, was, I think, basically the heart of the agreement. Yeah. And then related to that is whether or not the Son is eternal, or whether there was a time whether God created the Son in a sequence of events, right? That this is sort of the heart of the controversy that Constantine sort of walks into. And so there's this whole background of why this homoousios word is suspicious. It comes from the Gnostics. It comes from weird pagan groups like the Hermeticists and the Manichaeans. We Christians don't use that word because it's weird. And so we're arguing about this, and both sides of the debate don't like the word homoousios. Both sides of the debate don't use that word because it's not in the Bible, it's outside of the Christian tradition, etc. And so,
and that's obvious in light of what happens to the word after Nicaea.
Right. So all of this is coming to a T, and Constantine is convening this council because he wants the Christians to get on the same page, because as you've said many times, his main goal is unity, 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 monotheism, brotherhood of love, and theological simplicity, and all that stuff. And so there's a debate within the Christians. Okay, well, talk about it, because we can persuade each other because we're reasonable and the truth is reasonable. We'll sort this out, and then we can basically usher in the monotheistic utopia. And so the debate is whether or not the Son is basically on a par or subpar to the Father, or to God. They actually just thought that the Father was God. They're not even really arguing if Jesus is the one true God, in a sense. That's not even the heart of the argument. So there's all these debates. Constantine has convened this council, and then all of a sudden, and then I'll hand it back to you. You suggest that it was Constantine himself that introduced this word as a way to solve the dispute.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you've described a lot of different theological views, and I think it's important to emphasize the diversity of views at Nicaea. There were many different Christologies represented there, and they all signed the creed. Well, not all of them, but many of them did, having completely different interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
And they agreed to a very unsavory word that had actually been banned by the well-respected Council at Antioch. How in the world does that happen?
Mm-hmm.
Constantine. That's how.
Right.
And
That's the only answer that makes sense to me. Like, you can totally imagine these Christians, some of them are quite old and can remember severe periods of persecution. And they all have this fear of the empire and fear of the state. And then suddenly the empire's on their side. And so they're in front of the empire, and all of the questions of how the emperor himself relates to the hierarchy of bishops, and who's more powerful. Do the bishops have the say? Does the emperor have the say? All of this is new. None of this has been settled, and they have great fear of the emperor, right? And for very good reason. And so when the emperor himself says, well, how about this, guys? How about we just say the Father and the Son are homoousios? I could just imagine being able to hear a pin drop in this room as everyone's like, did he just say what I think he said? Did he just use that word? Are we going to go along with this, guys? Like, are we allowed to disagree? Right? Like that's sort of the impression that I would get of what happened.
Yeah, I think it's a fair one. And I'll point this out. You may have some listeners who are asking questions about this. I'm very aware of all of the other arguments about how the word got into the creed, but I suggest that, of course, that you look at the book. But there is also a presentation that I did on this very topic back in, I think it was 2018, called Revisiting Homoousios. And actually, so if you Google that title, maybe you can put a link to it if people are
I'll link
interested.
it in the description. Yeah.
Yeah, because this will go into way more detail than we're going to be able to do today. And there's actually a high quality version of it which premiered on the Trinities podcast from Dr. Del Tuggy, and it has all the slides in there too. So it's really great. But it's interesting. You have a wide variety of people who ultimately signed the creed. You have Marcellus, Athanasius, Eusebius. All of these guys have wildly different Christologies. So how do they all agree to the homoousios? Well, that's simply because it could be interpreted in a variety of ways, and because it would force out Arius, who had already made his public disapproval of that word very well known. So it would force out Arius. It makes Constantine happy because he gets to draw in elements from his pagan monotheistic Hermetic tradition. And at the same time, because it can be interpreted in a variety of ways, it doesn't place too tight of strictures on the theologians there, who all believe in different things and are not necessarily trying to get after universal Christian truth and everybody believing the same thing at this council. And so I think my reading of this is the best one, the most coherent one that explains all of the data. And another thing that I do in the book that is brand new is I discuss Constantine's own Christology at the time of the Council of Nicea, and I actually argue that he himself had a subordinationist, Arian type, if you want to put it that way, Christology at the time of Nicaea. His understanding of the word homoousios is certainly not predicated on any Orthodox Trinitarian sense, which, as we talked about later, would not come until later. Earlier.
Did Constantine ever even use the word Trinity?
No.
Yeah. Well, I'll just throw that out there. Constantine, we have a lot of his writings, many of his theological statements, never even uses the word Trinity.
Look, to Constantine, the Son is a deuteros theos. He's the second God.
Right.
His theology is informed by the Hermetic theology that we described earlier. There are two beings. There are two gods who severally have but do not jointly constitute the same immaterial substance. Orthodox Trinitarianism says there are two or three persons within the same single instance of God's substance. This is very different.
Mm-hmm.
To my surprise, as I've questioned the traditional interpretations and even several recently scholarly assessments of Constantine's Christology at Nicaea, I have concluded that he in fact held to the very sort of subordinationist Christology that everyone understands that Nicaea was designed to condemn. Well, how in the world could he possibly do that? Well, we see that what Constantine has done, like many of the bishops there, is that he's creatively interpreted the creed to suit his own preferences. The Nicene Creed and its language was useful. And it also, including the word homoousios, it constitutes a useful mystery. He tells the bishops, and you can read this in Eusebius' relation of the event. He tells the bishops that they should conceive of homoousios in a divine and ineffable sense, okay? In a way that can't be articulated. He has opened the door, therefore, to creatively interpreting this word however one sees fit, just so long as you use this word. Right. Therefore, what you ultimately have with Nicaea is you have a creed. That's what you have. You don't have a particular theology. You have language which is forced by the emperor in order to strike a consensus. And there are theological reasons, as we've talked about, why Constantine would want that consensus so badly. So back to your earlier introduction of this topic, many people assume that the Council of Nicea represents an ecumenical, a truly ecumenical movement of the church to get together and to just nail down what Christians have always believed in light of this new waylaying marauder who suddenly appeared in the form of Arius. But nothing could be further from the truth. To say that Nicaea represented in any way the moment in which the Trinity or something like the Trinity finally won out over the sudden and recent heresy that Jesus was a subordinate entity to the one God. Well, this is only a caricature of church history and a deeply partisan one at that.
Yeah, so there was a huge...
Constantine himself gives the game away.
Yeah, so there was a huge variety of people with a huge variety of opinions, somehow none of which were actually Trinitarian, that were able to be bridged together. And this is where I think understanding Constantine as probably extremely intelligent, very well read, right? Like Constantine knows the Christian tradition. He knows the different sides and the different camps of the Christian theological debate. He's also read his Plato. He's read his Hermetic literature. He knows his Neoplatonism. All of these things. He probably, like I said in the beginning, he was probably among the most well-educated and most intelligent people there. And that he uses this word strategically to be an ambiguous thing, an ambiguous umbrella that everyone can stand under, and the people who really want to get Arius's head on a spike can have that little pleasure too, because Arius just a couple years before said he didn't like that word. So it's crafted mystery, repurposing and reappropriating a word from Gnosticism, from pagan Gnosticism, and giving it new meaning or opening it up to new possibilities of meaning, because same substance really, even in English, is a very ambiguous thing to say. And that this is his solution to try and unify the church so that we can begin the, ushering in of the monotheistic utopian millennial Rome that will never die away.
Is to unify the church.
Mm-hmm.
It's also to unify the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and those are the same thing. Yeah,
because homoousios, he pulls this from pagan monotheistic tradition. So this is something that can be appreciated by pagan monotheists as well, not just Christians.
Right. That's also another good point. That he, with this word, he's elbowing his friends that he grew up with. Come on, you Hermeticists! Like we're going to get on this Christian train now, but don't worry, it's not so bad. Right? That we can still use the word homoousios, and I mean, you guys believe in God the Father and God the Son too. So it's how different are we really? Yeah. And this is just not the story that you ever hear. And so I really appreciate you kind of digging this up. I guess now to maybe kind of begin to close things out. What was sort of Constantine's? So actually, first question: the Council of Nicea, was it to make a creed that all Christians would recite in all of their churches as part of their liturgy?
It's a good question. I think probably so. Well, it depends. I mean, there's a lot of different perspectives to be had here. Probably some of them thought that would be the way to go. I think Constantine certainly thought that this was the new standard. But what we also see is that there were definitely some bishops, I think, who had different motives and who thought maybe, well, let's make Constantine happy with this. I'm not happy with this, but we'll fix this later.
Yeah.
For example, there is a record in the account of Philostorgius, which take it for what you will, of Eusebius of Nicomedia, who signs the creed, but later comes back and repents and tells Constantine that he's signed on to the heresy because of fear of you. And Constantine gets very upset and banishes him to Gaul. But what is certain is that there are many people who are deeply uncomfortable with the presence of this tradition that has been struck in Nicaea. It is either insufficient or downright heretical in some of their minds, which is why there is an effort on behalf of Hosius of Cordova and Marcellus to upend this word and to strike it from the creed. And that's what happens in the subsequent.
And they aren't on the Arian side.
From the creed.
They
and
aren't.
You can see people.
Hosius and Marcellus aren't Arians. They're, if anything, further in the other direction.
That's right. I mean, Marcellus has sometimes been described as having a modalistic type of theology, a Sabellian type of theology. He's definitely not in the Arian camp. But you know what he is in? He's in the anti-Hermetic camp. He actually lambasts the Arians for having a Hermetic type of theology, right? He says, that's just where these guys learned this thing, because he can't stand their Arian doctrine of two gods, which is very reflective of the Hermetic doctrine of two gods, of two distinct entities who, severally have this divine substance. And it's interesting, he rails on and on against this Hermetic theology, but curiously, he never speaks ill directly of the word homoousios. Though he's instrumental in helping to remove it in later grades, he never speaks directly against it.
Yeah.
Might that be because that's the emperor's property?
Yeah.
Anyway, the bottom line is that people were not happy with that tradition, certainly, and which is why it causes so many issues in the subsequent decades of debate.
Right, and you won't see a Christian council use that word again for something like 50 years, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Well, even Athanasius, it takes him quite a while to start using that in his writings, doesn't it?
Yeah, so even the people who maybe are in the trajectory towards what will become the Trinity don't like this word when it gets used, don't use it afterwards. And there are multiple councils, both sort of in an Arian direction or a non-Arian direction for the next 50 years of Christian development, and none of them like this word, and they avoid it, and they come up with other language to try and express or counter-express similar or different ideas. But
Right.
here it is at 381 AD at the Council of Constantinople, the homoousios had seemingly gotten even more repurposed to mean something very different than even it had maybe kind of meant or not even meant at the Council of Nicea. And then it gets reincorporated into the creed, and that's sort of the council to end all councils on creed making.
Well, thanks to Theodosius's sword.
Right, yeah. And unlike his predecessor, he was perfectly happy using violence and coercion to get people to agree with things. So I guess my question is so what did Constantine think of Jesus? And because he really does seem to have become at least somewhat Christian by the end, not just like all paths lead to monotheism kind of thing, but he really
Right.
does seem to have some fidelity to Jesus and the New Testament and Christianity by the
Oh,
end. How does that come about, and how do you understand and make sense of that?
well, certainly. I don't want to mislead anybody to think that um, he was purely a pagan. He's a sincere believer in the Christian God for the whole of his career. He just happens to get a little bit clearer and seemingly a little bit more Christian as time goes on. But he absolutely believes and came to believe, I think, very early that Jesus is the agent of the supreme God. This is the one who God had sent to restore monotheism. And he was in love with that story, and he saw himself as fulfilling the mission begun by Christ. As the new Logos, as Eusebius very clearly describes him. The Logos indwells within the emperor, and through the emperor, the God's Logos shines forth, enlightening all nations so they see the truth of God. So he loves this story, and I think the Donatist and more particularly the Arian disputes cause him to sharpen his Christian theology, and he starts to have to get more particular about this and figure out what he thinks about these things. And so as I said, I think that at the time of Nicaea, he comes to have a subordinationist view, and it's possible based on one quote in one of Athanasius' copies of Constantine's letters that he may have shifted in that view later, and probably did. But ultimately, I see him becoming a Christian at the end of his life. And what do I mean by becoming a Christian? Again, I interpret Constantine's experience through the contemporary paradigm of psychology of religious conversion as a gradual conversion in which he has gone through a series of changes in his life, which have ultimately caused him to arrive at a very dramatically different position. There is no doubt that at the end of his life, as he is baptized on his deathbed, this is the moment when he formally converts. Okay, he had not, contrary to what many Constantine scholars have said, he does not formally become a Christian at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. If you read his speech, you'll find it very informative in this way. He says on his deathbed, as he's being baptized, now I am ready to take up salvation. Now I am ready to be numbered among the people of God. What kind of Christian is not able to be numbered among the people of God and is not able to be saved? He is not ready to become formally a Christian until this point. And he says, now I'm going to take up a life, my behavior will now be, commensurate with, Christian practice and all of that. He lived his life outside of the formal structure of the church, and he did it on purpose. He believed that this is something a way God wanted him to live, the way the Christian God wanted him to live. He says to the bishops, he says, you have been appointed as bishops of those inside the church. Perhaps I have been appointed as bishops of those outside the church, right? So why is this guy going to bring himself under the jurisdiction of the bishops until the end? He has no need to do that. In fact, it would only hamper him, I think, right? Christian conversion in the 4th century, there's a long process of catechesis, and there are monitors that are appointed to you to make sure that you're not double-minded about this thing, and that your behavior is really changed. There's this entire process before people can become Christians in that period. Constantine has no need for that. He's the agent of the supreme God. He's the one that God has chosen to restore his true religion. He's Jesus' successor and perhaps not the author, but the finisher of the Christian faith. So why does he need to do that? But as he comes to the end of his life, his role is done. Eusebius says this in his biography. He even says, you should read Eusebius on this. It's pretty mind-blowing. Eusebius says all the prophecies about the kingdom of God and the restoration of peace on the earth and all that's all come true in Constantine's reign. And anybody who doubts it has some kind of slanderous mind. So Constantine has really established God's rule. He's done what he came to do, and he's going to be buried in his church that he built. Right? Not among the 13 apostles, but at their head as the new Logos is how he's buried. And I think that's how he's really saw himself. His work is finished, and now he's going to take on this life.
So do you think he saw himself as sort of chief among the apostles?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Much more than that. I think that he saw him, and you can read this in the book. There's some scholars who have worked on this, but I think he saw himself as the new Logos. He's not one of the apostles. He's not the 13th apostle, as people characterize him. I think that's a way that Christian theologians later kind of covered over that kind of embarrassing and overly ambitious claim. But again, you have to read all of the evidence through the narrative about monotheism and its restoration that I lay out in the book, and you can see that. When he in his tomb that he designs, there are the 12 coffins, the reliquaries that are sitting there to receive their bones, and some of them he actually gathered up, or allegedly, and he's not among them. He's at their head. He's not one of the 13. He's something else. He's something special. He's the right-hand man of the supreme God, and you can see that even though he has come into this formal Christian faith, he still maintains this distinction between himself and the apostles. Even in the end, in the bishops, even at the end, he thinks the bishops, they just won't stop fighting. He says, but I have shown the barbarians true religion, right? He says, but the bishops, they only, continue on with behavior that frankly contribute to the destruction of the human race.
So he views himself as some sort of eschatological fulfillment, an agent that is in some sense a new embodiment of the Logos, and the closest peer that he might think he has is Jesus himself.
Oh, certainly.
That is something. That is something else.
Read Eusebius. Yeah. All of the prophecies of the kingdom in which the nations beat their swords into plowshares. That's all been accomplished by Constantine in his reign. Yeah, wow. And Constantine, his reward in the afterlife is not merely the normative Christian reward, but it is a throne and a rulership. Constantine is a king and a king forever. Yeah. Yeah. So the real question then is, did Constantine really become a Christian? Formally, yes. Publicly, absolutely. Whether Constantine in his life and in his behavior, whether he actually made that journey to the cross of Christ, I think that's something perhaps only God will know definitively. But I think that my approach at least provides people with a way where they could believe him when he says that he is now ready to take up the life of Christ. But it's certainly a very interesting question, and what Constantine ultimately in his final moments really thought about Jesus and the life of a Christian. And it's something which, based on the evidence, we may not really know. But I think what is clear from the history is that he did convert at least in a public and formal sense. But at the end of his life, and as the final result of a long and gradual process of transformation.
And still views himself in a way that would make any modern Christian of virtually any stripe suspicious and scratch their heads
Well,
for
look,
someone to say that about himself.
let me point out this one thing. I asked the question in the book, was pagan monotheism still thought by him to be compatible with Christian monotheism at the end of his life? It's a hard question to say, but here's one thing I'll point out. In the year 311, this is before the Milvan Bridge or anything, he has a vision of the sun god, which is Apollo at this time for him. This is in the panegyric of 311. And in this, he says he saw this incredible vision, and in which he saw his own face in the face of the sun god. Okay? This is one of the things that motivates some of his imagery. And Constantine, throughout his reign, sets up statues of himself as the sun god. In the Basilica of Maxentius, he erects this colossal 40-foot statue of himself wearing the radiant crown of Sol Invictus. Right?
In a church?
No, this is a building begun by his predecessor,
Okay.
Maxentius. It was a kind of a forum. It's in the forum. It is a public
Okay.
building. But ultimately, when he builds his city of Constantinople, which Eusebius tells us is a purely Christian city with no pagan icons whatsoever, try again. He sets up in the central column a statue of himself. This is at the end of his reign, right? A statue of himself on the central column with, once again, the radiant crown as Sol Invictus. So what this shows us is that imagery, I think, that he first encountered in his very pagan vision in the year 311 continued to be important to him. And it continued, in some sense, to contextualize his reign, even within the midst of his very Christian city.
That's weird. And it's parallel to the homoousios thing, right? Like, is he bringing paganism inside to Christianity, or is he bringing Christianity inside to paganism? Is he wrapping them both together in some new grand syncretism? It's weird.
It's certainly something to think about, and not as cut and dry, I think, as many very partisan narratives would have us believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, man, with that image in mind of it's almost like Nebuchadnezzar or something like that, building a statue of himself like that. And so I asked you earlier, do you think that he thought he was divine? Because that, like, not the one God himself, but like divine is a fudgy word, but they also had fudgy uses of that word back then.
Yeah, no, I don't see that. There's no sort of incarnational motif surrounding him. He knows his father and his mother very well.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I don't see that at all. But he is what he says, the companion of the Supreme.
But he is of like cosmic final eschatological importance. Yeah.